Washington, D.C., November 1987. The autumn air carries the scent of exhaust and frying oil. A black sedan pulls into the parking lot of a McDonald's on Wisconsin Avenue, its diplomatic plates marking it as foreign, though few passers-by would notice or care. Inside the vehicle, 3 men sit in silence, their faces betraying nothing of the internal conflict each is experiencing. These are not ordinary tourists. They are officers of the KGB, the Committee for State Security of the Soviet Union, trained in surveillance, deception, and ideological warfare. Their mission today, however, is simpler and somehow more unsettling: to eat lunch at an American fast food restaurant. The driver, a man named Oleg Kalugin, who would later become one of the most famous KGB defectors, switches off the ignition. For a moment, none of them move. Through the windshield, they can see families streaming in and out of the restaurant, children clutching bright red boxes, teenagers laughing over trays of food, elderly couples moving slowly but contentedly through the familiar ritual of ordering and eating. The golden arches rise above the building like a corporate cathedral, visible from blocks away, a beacon of American consumer culture that has become, inexplicably, one of the most recognizable symbols on Earth. What happens in the next hour will trouble these men for years to come, not because they will witness anything shocking or scandalous, but because they will confront a reality so at odds with their training, their beliefs, and their understanding of how societies function that it will shake the very foundation of their worldview. They will taste a hamburger, and in that taste they will find something more disturbing than any military secret: the realization that perhaps, in some fundamental way, they have been lied to about everything. The Cold War by 1987 was entering its final uncertain phase. Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced glasnost and perestroika, policies of openness and restructuring that were beginning to crack the ideological certainty that had sustained the Soviet system for 7 decades. But for intelligence officers stationed abroad, particularly in the United States, the contradictions between Soviet propaganda and American reality had been apparent for much longer. These were men who lived double lives, maintaining their communist credentials while immersed daily in a capitalist society that functioned in ways their training insisted was impossible. The KGB had prepared its officers extensively for service in America. They studied English until they could pass for native speakers. They learned American history, culture, and customs. They were briefed on the social problems that plagued capitalist societies: poverty, crime, racial tension, exploitation of workers. They were taught that American prosperity, where it existed, was a thin facade maintained through imperialism abroad and oppression at home. The wealth was concentrated in few hands. The masses struggled. The system was inherently unstable and would, according to Marxist-Leninist theory, inevitably collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. McDonald's, in Soviet propaganda, represented everything wrong with American capitalism. It was a symbol of cultural imperialism, spreading American values and American products across the globe. It was an emblem of exploitation, paying low wages to workers while generating enormous profits for shareholders. It was a manifestation of unhealthy consumerism, encouraging people to consume cheap, nutritionally questionable food that served corporate interests rather than human well-being. Soviet officials pointed to McDonald's as evidence of capitalism's moral bankruptcy, a system that prioritized profit over people, quantity over quality, efficiency over dignity. But as Oleg Kalugin and his colleagues entered the restaurant that November day, they encountered something their briefings had not prepared them for. The place was spotlessly clean, almost clinically so, with floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights and tables that were wiped down constantly by employees in crisp uniforms. The smell was overwhelming, not unpleasant exactly, but powerful and omnipresent, a combination of beef, salt, and something sweet that seemed to permeate everything. The restaurant was crowded, yet there was order to the chaos. Lines moved with surprising efficiency. Orders were taken, prepared, and delivered with mechanical precision. Kalugin approached the counter, studying the menu board above. The prices shocked him immediately. A Big Mac meal, a sandwich, fries, and a drink cost less than $3. He calculated quickly. This represented perhaps 30 minutes of work for someone earning minimum wage in America. In the Soviet Union, a comparable meal, if available at all, might cost half a day's wages, and one would need to queue for hours to obtain it. The disparity was staggering, and it was just the beginning of his cognitive dissonance. He ordered, stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar ritual of customization. Did he want cheese, pickles, special sauce? The young woman behind the counter, barely 20 years old, smiled patiently and repeated his options. She showed no deference to his obvious foreignness, no suspicion of his accent. She was simply doing her job, helping a customer make choices about his lunch. This casual equality, this assumption that everyone who entered deserved the same service regardless of status or origin, was itself a kind of political statement, though the girl behind the counter would never have thought of it that way. The food arrived in less than 3 minutes, wrapped in paper and cardboard, steaming hot and smelling impossibly rich. Kalugin carried his tray to a table by the window, his colleagues joining him with their own orders. For a moment, they simply stared at the food. The Big Mac was larger than expected, its layers visible through the packaging. 2 beef patties, cheese, lettuce, pickles, onions, special sauce, all contained within a sesame seed bun. The fries were golden and crispy, salted perfectly. The Coca-Cola was so cold that condensation beaded on the cup's exterior. Kalugin unwrapped his burger and took a bite. The taste was immediate and overwhelming, salt, fat, umami, sweetness all combining in a way that seemed scientifically designed to please. It was not sophisticated cuisine, it was not subtle, but it was undeniably satisfying in a primal, almost embarrassing way. He chewed slowly, aware that his colleagues were watching him, waiting for his reaction. He swallowed, took another bite, and felt something crack inside him. The hamburger was good. Not just adequate or acceptable, but genuinely good. And more than that, it was cheap, fast, consistent, and available to anyone who walked through the door. There was no queue, no shortage, no need for connections or bribes. The teenager behind the counter had no power to decide who deserved to eat and who did not. The system simply worked, efficiently and democratically, serving hundreds of people per day with minimal friction or delay. One of Kalugin's colleagues, a man named Victor, who had been stationed in Washington for 2 years, broke the silence. "This is what they eat," he said quietly, gesturing at the families around them. "Not just sometimes, as a treat. Regularly, casually. They complain about it, even. They say it's not real food, that it's unhealthy, that there are better options." He paused, taking a long drink of his Coca-Cola. "But they have the luxury of complaining because they have choices. So many choices that they can afford to be dismissive of something that would be considered a feast at home." The observation hung in the air between them. They were intelligence officers, trained to observe and analyze, and what they were observing was a fundamental truth about the society they had been sent to undermine and understand. America had solved, perhaps imperfectly, but undeniably, the basic problem of feeding its population. It had done so not through central planning or state control, but through market mechanisms that incentivized efficiency, innovation, and responsiveness to consumer demand. McDonald's was not an aberration or a facade. It was a logical outcome of a system that treated consumer satisfaction as a legitimate goal and rewarded those who achieved it. The personal transformation occurring in these men was profound and painful. Kalugin had joined the KGB as a young man full of ideological conviction. He believed in the Soviet system, in its promise of equality and justice, in its mission to liberate humanity from capitalist exploitation. He had spent his career defending and advancing Soviet interests, convinced that he was on the right side of history. But sitting in that McDonald's, eating a hamburger that cost less than $3 and tasted better than anything he could reliably obtain in Moscow, he felt the certainty draining away. It was not just about the food, though the food was symbolic of something larger. It was about the entire ecosystem that made the food possible. The agricultural system that produced beef, potatoes, and vegetables in vast quantities. The transportation network that moved these ingredients efficiently across the country. The labor market that provided workers for every stage of production and service. The financial system that enabled investment and expansion. The regulatory framework that ensured basic standards of safety and quality. The consumer culture that created demand and drove innovation. All of these elements worked together, not perfectly but functionally, to create an outcome that Soviet central planning had never achieved: reliable abundance. The hamburger became, for these KGB officers, what the cereal aisle had been for earlier generations of Soviet visitors: a symbol that concentrated and crystallized the contradictions between ideology and reality. Every bite was an argument against everything they had been taught. The speed of service contradicted claims about capitalist inefficiency. The low price contradicted theories about exploitation and profit maximization. The quality and consistency contradicted assumptions about the superiority of state control. The casual availability contradicted the entire Soviet experience of scarcity and privilege. McDonald's had entered the Soviet consciousness years before any restaurant opened on Soviet soil. Soviet citizens who traveled abroad, whether as diplomats, athletes, or approved tourists, brought back stories of the Golden Arches and what they represented. These stories circulated through underground networks, whispered conversations, and carefully worded letters. The details varied, but the core message was consistent. In America, even poor people could afford to eat meat regularly. Even children could walk into a restaurant and order whatever they wanted. Even the lowest-paid workers had access to food that was hot, filling, and remarkably cheap. The Soviet government tried to counter these narratives with its own propaganda. McDonald's was portrayed as a symbol of American cultural imperialism, a corporation that exploited workers and poisoned consumers with unhealthy food. Soviet health officials published studies claiming that American fast food caused obesity, heart disease, and moral decay. Soviet economists argued that the apparent affordability was an illusion, that Americans were drowning in debt to maintain their consumer lifestyle, that the whole system was unsustainable and would soon collapse. But the propaganda was increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of direct experience. By the late 1980s, thousands of Soviet citizens had visited the West and seen McDonald's for themselves. They had tasted the food, observed the operations, and compared it to their own experiences at home. The contrast was too stark to explain away. Soviet cafeterias were characterized by long queues, limited selection, poor quality, and frequent shortages. The food, when available, was often barely edible. Service was surly and inefficient. The entire experience reinforced a sense of deprivation and powerlessness. McDonald's, by contrast, treated customers with a level of respect and efficiency that seemed almost utopian to Soviet visitors. The service with a smile that Americans took for granted and often mocked was, to people raised in a system where service workers held power over consumers, a revelation. The idea that the customer was always right, that businesses competed for consumer approval, that workers were trained to be helpful and friendly, these were not just commercial practices but philosophical statements about the relationship between individuals and institutions. Oleg Kalugin finished his Big Mac and sat back, watching his colleagues eat. He knew that this moment would stay with him, that he would remember this meal long after he had forgotten countless intelligence briefings and operational details. The hamburger was not just food, it was evidence. Evidence that the American system, whatever its flaws, had achieved something the Soviet system had not. Evidence that consumer capitalism, for all its wastefulness and inequality, delivered tangible benefits to ordinary people. Evidence that the ideology he had dedicated his life to defending might be fundamentally wrong. The broader implications were staggering. If America could mass-produce hamburgers efficiently and affordably, what else could it produce? If McDonald's could operate thousands of restaurants with consistent quality and service, what did that say about American organizational capacity? If teenagers could earn enough in a few hours to buy a meal that would be a luxury in Moscow, what did that say about American productivity and wages? The questions multiplied, each one undermining another pillar of Soviet ideology. The experience was shared by many KGB officers and Soviet officials stationed in America during the 1980s. Their reports back to Moscow became increasingly honest about American living standards, though they had to be carefully worded to avoid accusations of being seduced by capitalist propaganda. They documented the prices of goods, the availability of products, the efficiency of services. They noted that American workers, even those in low-wage jobs, had access to consumer goods that Soviet engineers and doctors could only dream of. They observed that American poverty, while real and serious, existed at a level of material comfort that would be considered middle class in the Soviet Union. These reports contributed to a growing awareness among Soviet leadership that the economic competition with America was being lost. Gap in living standards was not narrowing, but widening. The Soviet system was not catching up, but falling further behind. The promised future of communist abundance was receding rather than approaching. By the late 1980s, even hardline communists had to acknowledge that something was fundamentally wrong with the Soviet economic model. The decision to allow McDonald's to open in Moscow in 1990 was both symbolic and practical. It represented an admission that the Soviet Union needed to learn from American success in feeding its population. It was a gesture toward the market reforms that Gorbachev hoped would revitalize the Soviet economy. And it was a recognition that Soviet citizens wanted what Americans had, not just hamburgers, but the entire system of abundance and choice that hamburgers represented. When the first McDonald's opened in Pushkin Square in January 1990, 30,000 people visited on the first day. The queues stretched for blocks, with people waiting hours for a chance to taste the food they had heard so much about. Soviet citizens paid what was, for them, a significant sum for a Big Mac meal, and they did so gladly, treating the experience as a special occasion. They marveled at the cleanliness, the efficiency, the friendliness of the staff. They photographed their hamburgers as if they were precious artifacts. They saved their packaging as souvenirs. The Moscow McDonald's became the busiest in the world, serving tens of thousands of customers daily. It was more than a restaurant. It was a symbol of the changes sweeping through Soviet society, of the opening to the West, of the acknowledgement that capitalism had something to offer. Young Soviets who worked there were trained in American service standards, learning to smile at customers and say, "Have a nice day," in Russian. The contrast with traditional Soviet service culture was stark and deliberate. But for Oleg Kalugin, sitting in that Washington McDonald's in 1987, the opening of a Moscow restaurant was still 3 years in the future. What he knew, in that moment, was that he was experiencing a crisis of faith. The hamburger in his hands represented everything his ideology said should not exist. It was affordable abundance created by capitalist enterprise. It was quality and efficiency achieved through market competition. It was a democratic experience available to everyone, regardless of status or connections. He thought about his children in Moscow, about the queues they stood in for basic necessities, about the shortages that defined daily life, about the privileges he could access through his position that ordinary citizens could not. He thought about the propaganda he had helped disseminate, the lies about American poverty and Soviet prosperity. He thought about the years he had spent serving a system that promised a better future while delivering a worse present. The taste of the hamburger lingered in his mouth. Salt, fat, that special sauce, whose recipe was a corporate secret but whose appeal was universal. It was, he realized, the taste of defeat. Not military defeat or ideological defeat, but something more fundamental. The defeat of a system that could not feed its people as well as its rival, that could not provide the basic abundance that its ideology promised, that could not compete with a corporation's ability to deliver a consistent product at a reasonable price. His colleague Victor spoke again, his voice low. When I first arrived here, I thought it was all propaganda, all staged for our benefit. I thought the stores were stocked only in areas where foreigners lived, that the prosperity was concentrated in a few showcase cities. But I have traveled across this country now. I have been to small towns and big cities, to rich neighborhoods and poor ones, and everywhere, there are McDonald's. Everywhere people can afford to eat. The abundance is real, Oleg. It is real, and it is everywhere. Kalugin nodded slowly. He knew Victor was right. He had seen it himself in his own travels. American poverty existed, certainly, but it existed at a level of material comfort that would seem like prosperity in the Soviet Union. American inequality was real, but even those at the bottom of the economic ladder had access to food, shelter, and consumer goods that Soviet citizens could only access through privilege or black markets. The third member of their group, a younger officer named Dmitri, had been silent throughout the meal. Now he spoke, his voice tight with emotion. My father fought in the Great Patriotic War. He nearly died at Stalingrad. He believed, truly believed, that he was fighting for a better world, for a system that would bring justice and prosperity to working people everywhere. He raised me to believe the same thing. And now I sit here, eating this hamburger, and I think, what was it all for? What did he sacrifice for? A system that cannot even feed its people as well as a fast food corporation. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and devastating. They finished their meals in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, grappling with implications too large to fully process. When they finally rose to leave, they carried their trays to the trash receptacles, another small marvel that customers cleaned up after themselves, and walked back to their car. The ride back to the Soviet embassy was quiet. They passed other McDonald's locations, other fast food restaurants, supermarkets, shopping malls, all the infrastructure of American consumer capitalism functioning smoothly and efficiently. The city around them was not a propaganda showcase, but simply a city, with all its problems and imperfections. Yet underlying it all was a level of material abundance that made Soviet achievements seem meager by comparison. Epilogue. The hamburger sits in memory now, a taste that outlasted an empire. Oleg Kalugin would defect to the West in 1995, after the Soviet Union had already collapsed, and he would speak openly about his experiences and his gradual disillusionment with the system he had served. The McDonald's meal in 1987 was not the only factor in his transformation, but it was emblematic of the countless small encounters with American reality that eroded his ideological certainty. In interviews, he would describe that moment as a turning point, when abstract theories collided with concrete experience and experience won. The story of KGB agents breaking down after tasting McDonald's is not about hamburgers, not really. It is about the power of ordinary experiences to challenge extraordinary beliefs. It is about the difficulty of maintaining ideological purity in the face of contradictory evidence. It is about the human need for abundance, choice, and dignity, and about the political systems that either fulfill or frustrate those needs. The Cold War was fought with nuclear weapons and proxy conflicts, with espionage and propaganda, with ideological arguments about human nature and social organization. But it was also fought in McDonald's restaurants and supermarket aisles, in the mundane details of daily life where ordinary people experienced the practical consequences of different economic systems. The Soviet Union could match America in missiles and satellites, but it could not match America in hamburgers, and that failure was ultimately more significant than any military balance. The hamburger, in its simple abundance, represented a truth that ideology could not overcome. That human beings want not just survival but satisfaction, not just equality but choice, not just security but the freedom to pursue their own preferences and pleasures. The Soviet system promised these things in the future, always in the future, after the transition was complete and communism was fully achieved. But the American system delivered them now, imperfectly and unequally but tangibly, in the form of a Big Mac that cost less than $3 and could be obtained in less than 3 minutes. The KGB officers who tasted that truth found it hard to swallow, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was undeniable. They could write reports explaining it away, they could maintain their ideological commitments publicly, but privately they knew what they had experienced. They had tasted abundance, and in that taste they had glimpsed the future. Not the communist future they had been promised, but the capitalist present they had been taught to despise. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many factors contributed to its demise: economic stagnation, political rigidity, nationalist tensions, the costs of empire, the failures of central planning. But underlying all of these was a simple reality that Soviet citizens had come to understand. The system did not work. It did not deliver on its promises. It could not compete with the West in providing the basic material abundance that people desired and deserved. The hamburger was a symbol of that failure, a concentrated representation of everything the Soviet system could not achieve. It was cheap abundance where Soviet citizens experienced expensive scarcity. It was efficient service where they experienced bureaucratic dysfunction. It was consumer choice where they experienced state control. It was casual accessibility where they experienced privileged access. In every dimension, the hamburger represented a better answer to the question of how to organize economic life. The KGB agents who broke down after tasting McDonald's were not weak or traitorous. They were human beings confronting a truth too powerful to deny, that their life's work had been in service of a system that could not deliver on its most basic promises, that their sacrifices had been for a cause that was losing not because of external enemies, but because of internal contradictions. The hamburger did not cause the Soviet Union to collapse, but it revealed why the collapse was inevitable. And so we remember them, these men who sat in a McDonald's in Washington in 1987, eating hamburgers and feeling their worldview crumble. We remember them not to mock their confusion or celebrate their defeat, but to recognize in their experience something universal about the human condition, the difficulty of changing deeply held beliefs, the pain of confronting uncomfortable truths, the courage required to acknowledge when we have been wrong. The hamburger, in its humble way, taught them what no amount of propaganda could obscure, that systems must be judged not by their promises but by their results, not by their theories but by their practices, not by their ideals but by their ability to meet human needs. This is the lesson of the Cold War, written in the taste of a Big Mac, preserved in the memory of men who served one system and discovered the superiority of another through the simple act of eating lunch. The golden arches still stand, monuments to a victory won not through force, but through function, not through ideology, but through efficiency, not through propaganda, but through the undeniable reality of a hamburger that costs $3, tastes good, and is available to anyone who walks through the door. This was the weapon that helped win the Cold War, not a missile or a bomb, but a Big Mac, and the entire system of abundance it represented.